Hey folks, thanks very much for joining our Monday Mindshare. Joined this week with the one and only Zach Bitter. Thanks for joining us again, bud. Good to see you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
I'm sorry I haven't got the tie and suit like some of your other recent podcast interviewees. A little more relaxed here, so apologies. But two topics that has come up quite consistently across ambassadors and athletes alike. One on periodization and what you're doing in, your, what now is it, more than a decade, right? Experience on low carb, high fat. And then the second topic is really around this, emerging kind of question of optimizing using 2 workouts a day versus a single workout a day. And maybe in the professional world, 2 workouts a day is normal, but in the age group world, it's usually a choice. So it'd be good just to kind of look at some of the science and also experience from what you've seen. So how's training anyway?
Right now, quite low. I've been dealing with a bit of an ankle issue, so I think I'm able to run on it, but I just have to be kind of mindful. I actually have like 2 partial torn ligaments in my ankle, and because of those, it's driven a little bit of tendonitis in the area. So that is kind of had me put pause on the buildup, but I've been incredibly fortunate with injuries throughout my career. I've had one to date that has actually had me cancel a goal event other than this one.
Right.
And I think I could probably push through this situation for like a single day ultra marathon. But as you know, I had a big project on the calendar this fall, which is to run from San Francisco to New York. And there's just, everyone I talked to said, your A goal's off the table for sure, because you're going to be managing that thing the entire way.
Right.
So like that was kind of I wouldn't say a no-brainer, but it was, the big question was, is it worth doing it without your A goal versus pausing it and then moving into a different year and kind of doing it with all cylinders firing, so to speak. So I've been real fortunate in terms of kind of the progress so far. And it looks like I'll be able to kind of get back into meaningful training by mid-August, if all goes according to plan, and then still be able to do some racing in the fall, in the winter, to kind of test it out and see where it all is at that point. And then I can kind of restart any types of, I think simulations maybe to test to see how it would hold up for something more similar to like the transcontinental run. And
well, hey, we wish you all the best recovery, bud. I mean, I know it's always frustrating, but yeah, it sounds like you've had a good run, and sometimes it catches up with you. So I'm sure the recovery will happen even faster with all the work you're doing on it to get it there. Hey, so let's jump into this topic, and maybe just stepping back for a sec, just to set the tone on periodization. Obviously, I think most folks in this space well aware of what that represents in a training context. I think as different athletes kind of coming into low carb, high fat approaches, sometimes there's a natural gravity to it, whereby as you go through the season, obviously your demands are different. And people kind of ask me, tell me about the diet. Well, in a sense, it's not about a diet. It's about diets, plural, because it's kind of altering and changing. It's dynamic, right? Mm-hmm. So there is a natural shift between obviously base building and more high intensity work. And that's what I think we want to talk a bit more about today. Certainly, some of the experimentation I've had is just also around even different types of fats in different parts of the season, in knowing that certain fats are handled very differently in terms of their speed to support the metabolism. So anyway, that's the spirit of it. I'm just going to share some of the kind of questions, if you will, Zach,
sure.
That come up. But maybe before we just jump straight into these questions here, why don't you kind of just give us your high-level view of, if you think about a stepping back macro cycle of the year, what does it mean for you, periodization, as it relates to diet?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think you're spot on when you're asking an endurance athlete who is periodizing their training about their diet. You're probably asking them to describe 4-person's diet, essentially, because we're talking about different phases of the training year, and different intensities, different workouts, different volumes, different goals too. I mean, like even if you look at it like a micro sense, there's days where I'm stressing my body and there's days where I'm recovering from that stressor. So I'm able to get up and do it again and eventually kind of make small steps towards whatever I'm trying to get to. So even that has a little bit of variance in it. And for me, it's the starting point is always, well, what are you trying to prepare for? So endurance sport is quite multifaceted in that, I mean, you have some pretty intense events that are still considered endurance events. And then you have stuff that I do, like 100-mile stuff, or you could probably compare that somewhat to like Ironman triathlon, full triathlon type stuff. And picking that first kind of sets the stage in terms of what I'm going to do in terms of order of operations. The workouts I actually do will be fairly similar, whether I were training for, say, like a 5K or a 100-miler. Just might depend on where I put them. So the one thing that kind of, I think, stays true throughout is having that aerobic foundation or that base building phase. So for me, what I'll do is I'll be kind of gauging where my pace is in a controlled environment at my aerobic threshold. So like historically, when I get down to kind of like a low 6-minute mile right at my aerobic threshold, I know I'm kind of at a point where I'm pretty much peaked at that.
You've primed it, right?
Yep. Yeah, the foundation is laid, and I've gotten it a little bit under 6 in the past when I've had just really good buildups, maybe a little more time, and but anywhere probably between like 555 to 605 mile pace at for me it's about 155 beats per minute is going to be kind of a sweet spot for me to know, like, okay, now I can start kind of putting the pieces together towards whatever event I'm specifically training for.
Right.
Then the next step is working on what is least specific and any potential weaknesses first. So that's just, I want to be kind of gearing towards strengths near the end so I can really leverage those. They're going to be a bigger mover for me on race day. So a lot of times the race intensity kind of guides that. So if I'm doing like a 100-miler or training for a 100-miler, we're talking short intervals, like VO2 max type workouts are going to be the least specific.
Right.
Still very important, as you know, you get fit in that system of training and you're raising your capacity, your aerobic capacity. So then when I do get around to training for the specific intensities of the 100-miler I'm going to do, I have a higher ceiling of capability to get to. So that might be somewhere in the neighborhood of like, say, 4 to 6 weeks. I'll be doing usually intervals between 30 seconds and 4 minutes is kind of the range that I'll work within. Okay. And they're all kind of based on about the intensity that I could cover in essentially about a 12 to 15-minute time trial is kind of how I base that. And, like I said, I'll spend maybe 4 or 6 weeks kind of developing that. That'll oftentimes mean building up to, say, 2 sessions like that a week, or upwards towards maybe 30 minutes of total work with the interval structure. And then since 100 miles is kind of pushed quite far to one end of the spectrum on intensity, I tend to blend less intensities. I tend to kind of move from one to the next a little more. I've done it differently in the past.
Is that in the same session or like across sessions? You're talking that?
Across like entire training blocks, actually. Okay. So like I might spend, say, 4 to 6 weeks focusing just on VO2 max development and hardly do any, like, say, lactate threshold type workouts.
Got it.
I'll still be doing easy recovery runs and some what I call base building runs, which are like up to my aerobic threshold, or what folks maybe would see as kind of like a maximum aerobic function target during that. But I'm going to save the majority of that for kind of peaking for the 100, because that happens to be pretty close to what I can sustain for 100 miles anyway.
Yeah.
Then I'm kind of just moving closer. So short intervals, 30 seconds to 4 minutes. Then I'm moving into kind of longer intervals and what you call maybe tempo run, which is just going to be the target of my lactate threshold. And typically I'm using as kind of a guide there the intensity I could sustain for like a 60-minute time trial if it were a race day setting. Or for folks who are familiar with like Joel Friel's lactate threshold heart rate test, where it's like a 30-minute time trial and you average out the last 20 minutes. I'll use that one too if I'm doing it by myself and you don't have like the motivation of being at an event.
Yeah.
I've even used half marathons for it in the past, because usually if I'm just in shape at all and coming off of some short interval sessions, I can usually get to around a 70-minute for a half marathon. So I'm kind of in the ballpark there, and I can get a pretty good look at like where my heart rate is for that sort of intensity. And then I'm just building workouts kind of focusing on that. So it could be anything from 8-minute intervals up to 20-minute intervals, or 20-minute tempo runs up to, I usually don't go much past 30 minutes for those, but I'm targeting more or less around building up to about 60 minutes of total volume at a week. I've built up to 90 in the past. Usually I reserve that if I'm maybe doing something that's a little shorter than 100 miles, say like a 50 miler or something like that,
Right.
where I might actually be in kind of this gray area zone where I'm above my aerobic threshold, but below my lactate threshold for huge portions of that day, or
Right.
half day in the case of 50 miles. But yeah, then I kind of move even closer, and then I hit a phase where I'm going to probably spend the last 4 to 6 weeks before tapering really just dialing in specifics of race intensity.
Right.
So for
Is
100
that also an
mile,
elevation? I mean, I know you do a lot of track work at a race context, but if it were to include race day, a lot of elevation, that's I assume a critical element, right? And it plays around with aerobic and base, obviously, that elevation type running.
yeah, you kind of want to look at it from two different lenses. One is just the intensity and doing your workouts at the intensity you plan on racing at, but then also in the environment.
Right.
So for the
Exactly.
flat track stuff, that's really easy to replicate. You just find a track and do your long runs on the track, which can be boring, but it also has a lot of control. And when it's summer in Phoenix, it's kind of nice being on a track because then you just have a nice cooler there and have all your ice and water in
Really?
there. Yeah. So that's kind of helpful actually. But look, at when I trained for the San Diego 100, I was out at a spot called Mount Ord quite a bit, which is just like a 7.5 mile climb, about 4,000, maybe a little over 4,000 feet of climbing, and then back down that. And then you can really work on just the climbing and descending aspect of the course too. So yeah, the environment, the temperature, the intensity, all that stuff, I think the more closely you can align it with race day, the better. It just
Right.
gives you more opportunities to practice, like, how's my fueling going to work? How's my hydration going to work? Is this a
Sure.
sustainable pace? And all those kind of questions that people are asking when they're kind of heading to the starting line.
Well, I think that sets us up well. Just how for your own obviously expertise and focus from a race perspective on the 100 milers and thereabouts. If we can, at the highest level, Zach, split out to if you will your base periods and then your more high intensity and pre-race periods. Let's kind of overlay macro shifts between fat, protein, carb, starting with maybe your base. Kind of what's characteristic of that in that period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'll usually reserve like off season or like where I am now, where I'm doing very little running and focusing on some strength and rehab type stuff for where I would be a little more strict ketogenic diet. So like right now, I'm well under 100 grams of carbohydrate per day and oftentimes under 50 grams.
Right.
That's pretty common for me, like post goal race for a couple of weeks, maybe a month or so, as I'm kind of transitioning from off season into training. And then once I hit base building phase, then I'm usually typically hitting 10 plus hours a week of training volume.
Okay.
So once I kind of get there, I kind of shift that kind of gram of carbohydrate number up to between closer to maybe 100 to 150 grams of carbohydrate per day.
Okay.
Part of that is just the relative increase in energy expenditure that I'm going to take on during that phase of training. If I am hitting my aerobic threshold consistently and kind of trying to build as much volume at that as I can get to, I'm going to be tapping into my muscle glycogen a bit during those workouts, not nearly
Sure.
as much as say, the VO2 max workouts or the lactate threshold workouts, but enough where if I can get up to kind of my historic peak volume during that base building phase, which sometimes does work its way up to 20 hours a week if I'm really like in a good groove,
Yeah.
then having kind of looking at your energy demands as a whole versus just a specific gram per day situation like you would for like a therapeutic ketogenic diet, I find kind of helps me stay on top of those glycogen reserves a little bit better. When in the past I have stayed kind of strict 50 grams or less through that phase, what I sometimes notice is I'll feel fine for a few days, but it's kind of like a downward sloping staircase where eventually you kind of get to that bottom and you hit that point where your body starts defending muscle glycogen by getting kind of stingy about giving it up.
Right. Right.
And then you just kind of, you feel like you're carrying a backpack around a bit when you're running.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and sometimes once I start introducing like long run development, it won't necessarily be like an exact gram per day every day. It might be, I might go over 150 on like a bigger day. And then I might, drop down under 100 on a rest day or something like that. So it's going to average that out more or less.
And are you choosing, like, as you kind of come into your base and you start raising that carbohydrate level, is there a more particular group of carbs that you're kind of typically leaning to, or it's changing all the time? How do you program that?
Yeah, I find that Yeah, I find the ones that work well for me, they just sit well on my stomach, that I enjoy. And usually what I recommend to the folks I'm working with is when you start bringing back some carbohydrate, this is a great way to make the nutrition strategy just a little more sustainable, so you don't feel like you're kind of removing an entire macronutrient from your potential table.
Right.
You have to say goodbye to your favorite carbohydrate or something like that.
Yeah.
So I usually say, like, pick within reason. Obviously, if someone says, well, my 3 favorite carbohydrates are Skittles, M&Ms, and Snickers bars, then I usually tell them, let's maybe pick a couple that are more whole food based. So like for me, I'll focus like on a lot of like berries, melons, fruits, sourdough bread, sometimes tubers, those sort of things to kind of make that carbohydrate. And then intra-workout stuff, I'll start mixing in the SFuels Race Plus as kind of that preferred.
Right.
And as I get closer, and we can touch on this maybe a bit later too, is when I get back to 100-mile specific training, like the intensity stuff, it's not that far from my base building phase in terms of intensities and just the way I gotta go about it. So when I do hit that point, I'm going to shift a significant more amount of my carbohydrate intake towards the SFuels Race Plus, because that's what I'm going to be consuming on race day.
Gotcha.
And it's just going to make it a lot more tolerable to have that kind of passing through my system all day long, when it's been something that's a little more routine in my day-to-day nutrition. So like making smoothies with that is usually kind of the go-to, or if I'm doing a big long run, that, you know, having a few packets of those throughout that and that sort of thing.
And then like when you start layering on that volume, do you feel like in yourself there's a natural desire for more protein, or it's just something you actively have to program yourself to do? Or how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think I think protein has been probably undervalued in the endurance running community for quite some time. That's one thing I've been pretty consistent about, more or less accidentally doing right most of my career. And now that I'm more aware of it, I just look at, okay, what am I doing and do I need to make any shifts? So the way I look at protein is I'm usually targeting about 1 gram per pound per day. As kind of like, this is what I need to get in. If I go over that by a bit, I'm not going to stress out about it. But I'm just trying to make sure I'm hitting that number. And I eat a fair bit of like animal products, so there's a lot of protein layered in. So it's really rare that I don't hit that number just by default. But if I do find that, like, you know, I'm having a bigger workout and I'm just not eating as many solid foods that day because of it, or it's just a little bit more activity, or I'm eating lower protein food sources or higher fatty cuts of meat, then maybe I'll go with like an SFuels Revival scoop in a smoothie or something, just to make sure I'm getting up towards that if I feel like I'm you know, kind of flirting below that a little bit.
Okay. And then as you start increasing the intensity as a ratio mix of your total workouts, what shifts the most between the fat, the carb, and the protein?
Yeah, I would say when I get into kind of like the more intensity based stuff, so like the short intervals, there's just a little bit of a trade-off where I'm going to trade out some of the fat for a little more carbohydrate, just because I'm going to be dipping in. I'm going to be going more glycolytic. I'm usually pairing those workouts with some of my heavier strength sessions too. So it's almost kind of like a double hit. So for those, what I'm usually doing is, the nice thing about them is they're a pretty big training load in a short period of time. So there's only so much damage you can do to your muscle glycogen levels during them. And I'm also a little lower volume during those phases of training to accommodate that increased intensity training load side of things. So then in my days just look a little more polarizing. So I might have a day where I'm doing, say, 5 by 3 minutes at my VO2 max intensity. And then I'm going to the gym later that afternoon and doing like squats, deadlifts, weighted lunges and things like that. You know, I might target closer to, say, like 200 grams of carbohydrate that day, but then the next day I might just have like an easy 60 minutes in the morning, you know, some stretching and mobility in the afternoon, in which case I'm barely touching anything that would require a carbohydrate. So then I might go quite low, like closer to 50 grams on that second day.
Yeah, I'm glad you touched on that. It's just this kind of dynamic kind of, you've got the macro high level cycles, but even inside of that, you're really shifting around almost day to day. I feel like for high intensity, even though it's lower volume, obviously intensity's up, it feels like the eccentric it creates greater eccentric load and lends itself, it seemed, to more delayed onset muscle challenges. I don't know if that's just me, but I sense that as you get closer to that race period, that tendency does go up, and I feel like the demand for protein goes with it. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I'm doing less intensity as I get right up to the race day. So here's where I would maybe deviate from my strategy is I was training for something that had a lot of downhill running and I didn't have great access to downhill training stimulus where I could get that eccentric load from the specific downhill running. I'd maybe inject a few more like sprint sessions and that sort of stuff.
Right.
I likely keep some strides around though too. So I'm going to get a little bit of it. But yeah, I think like, you're damaging muscle at a greater rate. So that protein muscle synthesis is going to be key. I think the big mover for me during that phase of the year is going to be less about getting more protein than I already have, because I'm already probably skewed a little more towards the higher end than most people are doing.
Right.
It's more about kind of maybe spacing it out a little more appropriately. So what we see in the more recent protein muscle synthesis type research is that the big step forward is making sure you get enough. So that's that gram per pound. Then you can take another step forward, albeit a much smaller one, by getting like 30-gram doses in the neighborhood. I think 3 is kind of the sweet spot, but some will say like 3 to 4 different like sections of the day. So rather than say hitting 75 grams of protein in one meal and 75 in another meal and having this kind of 2 big meals during the day, it might just behoove me to have like a couple more sections where every 3 to 4 hours I'm getting say 30 to 40 grams of protein in. And that's where I'll really lean on the SFuels REVIVAL, because then I'll kind of still stick to my 2 meal a day structure where my primary,
splitting it out. Right.
Yep. And then I can just, if those 2 meals are far enough apart, and they usually are, I can just drop in the middle there, like a smoothie with the REVIVAL protein in there, and whatever else I tend to mix into it.
And then just while we're on the microcycles, let's talk about the night before and the morning of. And I'm asking a 100-miler here. Obviously, that we've got a lot of audiences that are triathletes and what have you. But as it relates to an ultra runner, the night before and the morning of, as you think about macro selections, how does that pan out for you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the day or sometimes 2 days before, I'll just kind of revert to my macronutrient outlook from like a big training day in terms of like the ratio. So I'll let my carbs creep up a little bit, say on like Thursday or Friday before the race itself. But then when I have that last meal the night before, then I go to bed. I'll leverage the overnight fast that everyone's going to get regardless of their diet, unless they're waking up in the middle of the night and eating.
It happens.
Yeah, I know it can. So, but most of the time I'm assuming people are not eating in the middle of the night, but you never know. I'm going to leverage that overnight fast. So anywhere between like 8 to 10 hours, wake up that morning of 100-mile is relatively low intensity. So I'm not going to reintroduce carbohydrate before the event in terms of like that breakfast. So I might have something that's fat and protein based. And then once the race starts, I'm going to give myself about 45 minutes to kind of get the engine rolling, so to speak. And then I'll start introducing small amounts of carbohydrate to the tune of maybe 30 to 40 grams per hour. And I like to kind of do kind of a dual strategy where I have kind of a liquid calorie source. So like the Race Plus is perfect for me for that. I might do a couple of those per hour. As I get a little further into the race, I might start blending that with like a more solid, kind of different texture, salty, savory versus sweeter tasting, just to kind of
mix it up.
And then it's just I'm usually targeting about 30 to 40 grams per hour. And based on my fat ox tests that I've got in the past, that's probably a pretty good sweet spot for me, where, if you think of my 11-hour, 19-minute 100-mile, I'm probably between about 800 to 1,000 calories per hour during that. At that intensity, I'm burning somewhere in the neighborhood of like 80 to 90% fat, 10 to 20% carbohydrate. So that extra, couple hundred calories of carbohydrate that I'm taking in via the Race Plus is going to be just going to kind of defend. Yeah, it's going to, and for me, that's great, because when I'm at 40 grams or lower, it's super rare that I'll experience any type of digestive
Gut issues. Yeah.
And if I do, it's usually because I screwed something else up on like hydration or something like that, overheating, that sort of stuff.
So, never happens, right?
Yeah. As soon as you got one thing dialed in, you always you watch for something else to pop up. It's a little bit of whack-a-mole when you're doing 100 miles.
No, I think we're well aligned to what you're calling out there. Let's just go back to just quickly, just day-to-day meal planning. If you're trying to run these macros, I assume you're not a calorie counter, but I mean, do you use plate portioning, or how do you think about a breakfast or a lunch or a dinner in the spirit of trying to keep these high-level kind of macro constructs?
Yeah, some of it is just, for me at this point, almost just intuitive because I've been doing it for so long.
Right.
It took me probably about 1.5 to 2 years to kind of find out where the kind of ratios that worked well for me kind of fell. Once they did, it just became, then I spent essentially 8+ years just saying, okay, well, what food groups that I enjoy eating that I want to kind of keep around throughout the course of the year fit into that. And then it's just kind of knowing, like, if I'm doing a workout like this and I need to try to make sure I get in, say, 150 grams of carbohydrates a day, I kind of know which pool or which foods I can pull from that carbohydrate. Right. They're going to get me there.
Right.
And that's kind of how I've done it or looked at it in the past.
Do you start like, do you kind of, do you think in the back of your mind, you kind of start with my protein, or like, I mean, is there a base of one of those macros that you kind of build upon, or when you think about meals?
Yeah, so the protein stays relatively similar year round. That's probably the macronutrient that stays the most constant.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I guess I would say I start from the very beginning is let's get this one checked away, because that's kind of the necessity there. And then it's just about which fuel substrate do I want to have balance.
Exactly.
Yeah, so then I'm looking at it like that, and then it's kind of more of a percentage thing, more or less. And at that point, it's about where do those percentages get in terms of overall or how do I apply those percentages to overall quantity?
Yeah.
And that's going to be more or less driven by the workload, or the volume. So it's another thing I've gotten really good at doing intuitively, just because I kind of know, like, if I'm doing say 120-mile training week, a couple strength sessions in there, this is kind of like the amount of food I'm going to require to maintain weight. Sometimes it depends on the time of season. Coming off season, I may have a few pounds that I put on, and I look at that as a positive. So I'm not just like kind of sitting at race weight all year long.
Yeah.
And actually it's kind of nice because to a degree you fight the opposite battle that I think a lot of folks are, which is
holding it.
Yeah. It's more, so if I go into a training session or a training block in the base phase with a couple extra pounds on me, it just means I don't have to eat quite as much.
Yeah. No, I get it.
And then by the time I get to kind of peak training and I kind of have to force feed myself to a degree to stay on top of weight, then, I don't feel like I'm doing that all year, which is kind of nice. And, but yeah, then, I don't weigh myself every day or anything like that, but I'll hop on a scale once a week. Or if I notice I'm kind of feeling flat in a workout, just to make sure I'm not dipping under kind of what a preferred weight is for me from a performance standpoint. Usually if I start getting too much under around 140 pounds, I start noticing that I'm not recovering as quick. I'm a little harder to start in the morning, and, workouts are maybe a degree lower than they typically are. And, so some of these things kind of present themselves pretty quickly, and you can course correct soon enough and, either up the calories or adjust as needed.
Interesting. Well, hey, let's change topics. It is somewhat related, to be honest. But this question of kind of two sessions a day versus one per day, as I said earlier, I think professionals, of course, generally, in fact, in some sports, 3 a day is not uncommon. But for age groupers, left to their own devices, probably 1 a day is more normal. But there is this, and we'll bring up some of the research on the screen in a second, but this is all about, the research going on about improving the biodiversity, the density of mitochondria and biogenesis of mitochondria, and trying to increase that and signal acceleration of that density. And, like there's been different approaches. Obviously, going into sessions fasted is another approach that has been a bunch of research on. But this, in fact, out of Australia, my hometown, has been some of the research down under on just multiple close proximity training, and some of that having dramatic effects. And certainly I feel like the biggest gains, not just obviously in performance, but also in just your capacity to handle load, comes after you kind of don't just flick a switch, but as you get into double session days, it feels like the inflammatory load is lower, but obviously the ability to take capacity increases. So maybe I'll bring this research up, Zach, and then we can have a discussion on it. This was last year, January last year. Dave Bishop and a number of researchers. Dave's down in Victoria in Australia. But this was really talking about, there have been these prior models of train low or effectively glycogen depleted states, and coming into a training session as a trigger to higher signaling of increasing mitochondrial biogenesis. But this particular study was really interesting to really look at as you have these close proximity training sessions, that in fact, not just the biogenesis being increased for mitochondria, but also for fat oxidation. And interestingly enough, for any of the athletes there that are subscribing to Dan's workouts, it's very common to see his structures kind of coming into the schedule as a twice a day kind of program. So why don't we, jump across to what you've kind of experienced and worked with over the years, and what your experience has been here first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think like maybe the first part with 2 a day, and I agree. I guess you could say 3 a day in some case when you're looking at like strength sessions in the gym, which I'm going to be keeping around most of the year. So when I get around to doing 2 runs a day, there's going to be days that week where, unless I structure it so that I'm kind of doing strength sessions on days where I'm not doing a second run, I might be doing 2 or 3 runs fairly frequently. And usually for me, it's more just, and this probably feeds into that research just maybe a little less directly, is you get to a certain point where if I'm trying to hit X training load or X training volume, to do that in all singles takes on a pretty big injury risk. So like when I peak for 100 mile on a track, it's not uncommon where I hit 130, 150 miles of running during some of those big weeks. So, rather than trying to do, in the neighborhood of 7 20 plus milers each day, I'm going to be breaking those up, and especially if there's some quality sessions in there. So, I might end up doing, say a 45 to 60 minute easy run in the afternoons to just supplement whatever the primary workout was that I'll typically do in the morning. And that's just kind of how I close that gap. And from a training volume standpoint, where I know I'm hitting that stress response enough to elicit a gain versus kind of just staying put at where I'm currently at. But yeah, I mean, you can manipulate that even further. And I know the folks who are more in the moderate to high carbohydrate camp, they probably would benefit pretty greatly, especially if they got poor fat oxidation rates, from say doing a training session in the morning, staying away from some of their carbohydrate after that first workout. So they're going into that easy run that's not going to be too difficult to do, even if you're carb dependent, and kind of push some of that fat oxidation rate stuff in the other direction by kind of going into that second run of the day without having intact or fully intact muscle glycogen stores. So
in the example you gave there, you actually did basically, half the volume per session, but double the sessions. Mm-hmm. Is that at the highest level kind of programmatically how you think about it, or is there a bit more nuance to it than that?
Can you say that again?
Well, rather than you said, if I'm doing 150 miles, I can do the 7x20s, or I can do the, multiple 10s, right? Mm-hmm. So is it as simple as that, of just, effectively doubling the number, halving the volume per session, or there's more to it?
Yeah, personally, I'm going to probably be much closer to, like, say 2/3 of the work being done in the morning. And then having that second session of the day being a little shorter.
Yeah.
that may be a preference thing as much as anything, versus, and some of it is just a location thing too. If it's summer in Phoenix, it's like, I don't know if I want to go out for I've done it, but it's like, you're also juggling some other variables by heading out at, like, say 3 p.m. in the middle of summer here. So part of it, and some of it is psychological, I'm sure, as well, where I know if I can get 2/3 of my workout done in the morning first thing, then I feel like I checked a big thing off the list.
Gotcha.
Versus putting it in the afternoon. But I know there's been folks who, especially out here, there's been some pro triathletes who, they'll do a track workout at 9 p.m. because it's like the sun will be down. They can keep that off of them and that sort of stuff. Something is, I think it just depends on the person's schedule that dictates that too. Because, most people I'm working with, they're doing 8 to 10 hours of a job unrelated to the training. So for them, it's like, well, if I got a bigger block in the afternoon or an equal block in the afternoon, they might be closer to a 50-50 split, or skewing it the other direction where they do an easy run in the morning and the big workout in the afternoon.
Yeah. So let's just look at the first session you're doing that morning, that 2/3 session. You come out of that. What's the nutrition after the session? And then how do you think about prepping nutrition wise coming into your second session?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So after that first session, that's usually where I'll probably place my biggest carb bolus of the day. I'm usually, I build my fueling around 2 kind of core meals. So there's one kind of mid to late morning, depending on how early I get out. And then kind of the dinner one, which is going to typically take place after I finish whatever second session I did during the day, or whatever strength session I did in the late afternoon, early evening. And though I'm going to probably put more carbohydrate after the session, that tends to be a little more either glycolytic or higher in volume. So for me, that's almost always the morning session. So if I'm say I'm targeting 150 grams of carbohydrate for that day, I might have 100 of those grams in that post morning session meal, and then have the other 50, with dinner or something like that.
Does that, I'm not sure what time of day dinner is for you guys, but if I'm hearing you right, then it's not until the following mid-morning. So it would be just simple math. It's probably not improbable to see that as a 12 to potentially 15-hour stretch. Is that what the case is, or not?
Yeah, I try to be mindful of that, because I know the way I look at this is there's kind of 2 ways to look at kind of what you maybe call like time restricted feeding or fasting. And one is just like a time. So it's like, is it 12 hours, 14 hours, 16 hours? And then the other is energy expenditure within that window. So if I'm doing nothing, then it's pretty easy just to look at from a time standpoint. If I'm in a big training block though, then I'm in a situation where that 12 or 14 hours between dinner and that kind of mid-morning meal could be, an energy expenditure equivalent to, say, like a 36-hour fast at a sedentary energy output.
Yeah. Okay.
And I try to avoid having too many of those, because I just don't necessarily think it's going to send the right signal to my body, having that level of like energy scarcity. So in those situations, that's where I may lean on a little bit more nutrition in the morning before my first session as well. So if I have like a cup of coffee or tea or something in the morning, I might, add some calories to that. It's typically going to be mostly fat, maybe a little bit of protein, depending on kind of how the rest of my day's meals are looking like. Or like if I'm in a situation like I was describing earlier, where I'm going to be looking for 3 or 4 protein boluses during the day, then maybe that's a window where I can catch before, having my first full meal of the day.
That was just going to be my last question, was just the use of caffeine. And obviously coffee is a drink as much as water is these days. But do you try to use kind of caffeine a little strategically coming into the start of the day, and even that second session, just to kind of switch you on to kick into that session?
Yeah. I'll probably have more caffeine right in the morning than any other time during the day. When I'm in peak training, I'll sometimes have a little bit more before that second session. I try to be a little more stingy around caffeine once it's afternoon, just because I am what you'd probably call a hyper responder to caffeine, where if I have a cup of coffee at like 5 at night or 4 in the afternoon, I find that I'm more consistently going to wake up at 3 a.m. feeling like, is it time to get up already?
Yeah.
So
same here, man. I know, I'm the same. Exactly the same.
It's it sucks when you do that on accident or on purpose and find yourself losing sleep. But it's also the other side of that is like, I have a very, I guess, low tolerance in the sense that
it works really well.
It works really well. So on race day, a little bit of caffeine for each hour for the second half of a race is a great way to feel like that focus in and keep things moving.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, that's great. Well, hey, they were the key questions. I think we've gone through most of them, and it's awesome to catch up and just to dive into some of those areas. And hey, man, I'm just wishing you all the best for a quick recovery on this ankle.
Yeah, no, thanks. It's been fun to chat. Hopefully folks pulled some stuff out of this, and I'm looking forward to getting back to training when things are kind of back to normal. And, you know, I try to look at as many things positively as I can. And for me, you know, one of the downsides of being pretty injury resistant is, you know, you typically have less downtime. As athletes, we tend to like try to take the shorter off season if we can, I think a lot of times. So for me, sometimes it's just a good reminder. And I'm sure when I start training back up, I might notice some things that improve that I was just normalizing before. So I'm looking forward to getting back to doing some racing at the end of the year. And
sure. Well, hey, all the triathletes are probably thinking, hey, you know, you can swim and bike and it's easy on your ankle. Maybe you can do a few tries in the off season or something.
Oh gosh, you put me in the pool and no one's going to consider me an athlete. So
oh, well, you can run them down at the end of the race. That's okay.
I'll run very fast if I'm in the pool first. But
well, Bob, well, hey, great to talk to you and all the best, and we'll catch up with you soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Leighton.
All right, man. Thanks. Goodbye.